everybody, welcome back, and if you're new to my channel, welcome. Today I'm going to be recapping on Netflix's thriller show You, starring Penn Badgley, and if you are here on this video, I'm assuming you've watched the show or heard of it. It's a really intense and mind-blowing show, so if you haven't watched it already, please do so. I would watch it before this video because I'm going to be recapping the most recent season 4, and there will be a lot of spoilers. This season was released in 2 different parts, and it is one of the more complicated ones, so make sure you follow along and let's get into it. So a little reminder from season 3 finale, it wrapped up with Joe faking his own death by chopping off his toes after killing his ex-wife Love and burning her body in their old home in Madre Linda. It ends with a shot of Joe in Paris after he decides to follow Marianne, his new love interest, and the woman he had an affair with. Season 4 opens up with Joe, who now goes by Jonathan Moore as his new identity. And he now lives in England, specifically in London. He found a new career as a literature professor, and side note, I find it so hilarious that this man got away with so much in the past 3 seasons and can switch identities and lives like he's switching profiles. I know it's just a fictional show, but it's really funny seeing how Joe can just wake up one day and choose who and what he wants to be. We meet a new character who seems to be Joe's student, and her name is Nadia. She then introduces Joe to an author and hands him a book written by Rhys Montrose. Rhys is apparently really big in London and is planning to run for mayor, so he's pretty well known there. We're introduced to another character, Malcolm Harding, who is another literature professor, and Joe thinks this guy is a huge douchebag. Later, he's looking out his window spying on people, typical Joe behavior, and discovers that his neighbors are Malcolm and his girlfriend Kate. He stops himself and tries to remind himself that he's not going back to his stalkerish and obsessive behavior. Joe then goes to Sundry House, which is where he meets his new London friends, which are a group of super wealthy, popular, famous elites. Typical Joe, he did his research prior to meeting the group, so through his narration, he goes and analyzes each one of the characters. One of the characters he seems to hit it off with is Rhys, who is the author of the book his student recommended. They have a conversation about their childhood trauma, and Rhys leaves after having to catch a flight. Joe decides it's time to go home, but one of the girls, Phoebe, hands him an absinthe, which is a very illegal alcohol, or at least I think it's illegal, so correct me if I'm wrong. He passes out after drinking the drink and wakes up at his place with no recollection of getting there. So the next morning, he notices Malcolm's lifeless body on the table with a knife in his chest. He freaks out because he thinks that he did it to him because the previous night, Malcolm was bad talking about Marianne. And we all know how Joe gets when people disrespect the ones he loved. This is the first death we see in the new season, and this moment really sucks Joe back into his old self. You know, being a pro at disposing lifeless bodies, etc., etc. He decides to get rid of Malcolm's body in a very brutal way, and if you watched the episode, you would know I'm not going to get into detail here. Okay, one big question. Where is Marianne in all of this? Didn't Joe escape to Paris just to find her? And how did he end up in London then? We cut to a flashback of Joe in the streets of Paris looking for his lost love. He sees a painting that he recognizes as Marianne's and asks the person where he can find the artist. And they mention London. We then see Marianne walking through an art event and just enjoying her life until she spots Joe in the distance and starts panicking. If I was her, I would panic too. Then he starts running after her.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
She hides in a building after the chase, and once she thinks she's in the clear, she runs into crazy Joe on the staircase. She pleads and mentions her daughter Juliet because she knows that Joe has a soft spot for her, and that would be the only way he'd let her go. He wanted to prove to her that he's no longer a murderer, and he lets her go even though it breaks his heart. Once he's leaving the building, a mysterious figure watches him from afar. Once we see Joe walk into a restaurant and sit down, the man sits down and introduces himself as Elliot Tannenberg. He tells Joe that he knows all about his past and his baggage, and that he actually works for Ray Quinn, Love's father. He was actually sent there to kill Joe. but says that he's tired of doing the dirty work and doesn't want to hurt any more people. Elliot promises a new identity and clean slate for Joe in exchange for all the money in Love's account that Joe stole. However, he does mention that Joe has to tie all loose ends, including his loose end with Marianne, who knows exactly who he is and what he's done. In order to start his new life, he will need to get rid of Marianne and also send a picture of proof to Elliot that the job is done. Obviously, this devastated Joe because he contemplated even hurting her. So he does come up with a plan to spare her life. While she's headed for the train, he purposely bumps her into someone else, and while she's distracted because her things are on the floor, he smoothly sort of pickpocketed her locket necklace, and she turns around as soon as she feels it missing, but there's no one else in sight. He sends a picture of the necklace to Elliot to pretend that he finally tied all loose ends. Now back to the present. Joe's hanging out at the group's usual place, Sundry House. Kate, as the worried girlfriend, asks about Malcolm. Everyone collectively agrees that he is probably on one of his typical benders again, where he flies out and disappears for a couple days. So she isn't too worried. However, Joe receives a weird text message from an unknown person stating that he is watching and he knows exactly what Joe did to Malcolm's body. As he looks very paranoid, he scouts all of the friends in the group and assumes it has to be one of them. This mysterious murderer has a name called, quote, "Eat the Rich Killer," unquote, because they're mainly going around offing the elites in the group. It sets off the theme of the season, which is Joe trying to find out who is mysteriously texting him and killing his friends and taunting him about his past. So I want to highlight the more important parts of the season to wrap up this recap a little quicker. This video isn't going to be a breakdown of each and every episode, so fast forward. Joe ends up falling for Kate, who is Malcolm's girlfriend, and obviously now that he's gone, Joe wants to swoop in and get his chance. He initially tries to resist his feelings for Kate, but he can't help but like her personality because she's super blunt, honest, and seems to have a good heart. Another reason why they get closer is because the mysterious killer is still texting Joe, and he wants to stay close to her to protect her and also keep an eye out. That's when his stalker tendencies come in handy, I guess. He starts to make one of the other characters, Roald, jealous because Roald and Kate practically grew up together, and he's been trying to get at her for a long time. So Roald is also suspicious of Joe, so he's hating on him just a little. A couple more of their friends like Simon and Gemma get killed, and Joe struggles to catch up to the killer. In this last episode of part 1, Kate and Joe are trying to find a way to get rid of Gemma's body because she was discovered upstairs by Kate, and she claimed that she wasn't the one who killed her. Kate and Joe open up to each other, and that's when he realizes he's falling in love with her. But he's fallen in love with a bunch of other girls in the past seasons, and look how that worked out for them. He confesses to her that he was the one who disposed of Malcolm's body and that someone was out there trying to frame him. Roald later finds Joe in the barn outside with Gemma's unalive body and brings him to the group with a shotgun to his back and tells them that Joe has been doing all the killing and how it all started when he came into the group. Roald gives Joe a challenge to get a head start in the woods before he hunts him down, kind of like a game of hunting. As Joe and Roald are tussling in the woods during their chase, the real killer comes and captures them both. And the actual Eat the Rich killer was Rhys Montrose. No wonder he was gone like the entire season, right? He captures both Joe and Roald in his underground dungeon. Both are tied up by chains, and while Roald is knocked out, he tells Joe his motive and his plan. Rhys grew up in poverty and had a lot of animosity towards rich people growing up, which resulted him to commit those murders on all of his elite quote-unquote friends. Rhys tells Joe his plan to have Joe frame all the murders on Roald and to kill him. Joe refuses, and Rhys sets the place on fire and leaves them both in the dungeon. Later, Kate finds Roald and Joe underground and rescues them both before the fire gets worse. Joe sees Rhys announce that he's running for mayor on TV and decides now that Rhys essentially owns him because he has all the dirt on him, and in order to keep Kate away and safe, he breaks up with her in order to focus on bringing Rhys down by himself. So now that Reese essentially owns Joe, he tries to get Joe to frame someone else for all the murders. And Reese has all that dirt on him, so he's gonna want to obey. Joe finds the perfect opportunity to frame this stalker fan of Phoebe who trapped her in her own room. Dawn is the stalker fan's name, and she ends up getting arrested and framed for being the Eat the Rich killer. However, Joe's student Nadia witnesses the arrest and becomes really suspicious. This is a really important detail for later, so pay attention. Joe and Kate actually make up, and Kate wants him to meet her father for dinner. We learn a little bit more about her background and how she comes from a very wealthy family, and her dad, Tom Lockwood, is one of the most powerful businessmen in the game, and he has created a ton of enemies for himself. Kate actually despises her father because he takes advantage of his power to do horrible things and hurt innocent people. We also learn that in the past, Kate was partly responsible for her father's plan to build a pipeline, which resulted in many children getting cancer. So during dinner, Tom and Joe finally meet, and when they greet each other, Tom gets close and whispers, "Nice to meet you, Joe," in Joe's ear. So Joe freaks out because now he knows that his girlfriend's father, one of the most powerful men on the planet, knows about his past and who he really is.
Looking forward to getting to know you, Joe.
First of all, I'm not even surprised. When you're one of the most powerful, wealthy people on the planet, you best believe that you have a great PI team. I'm sure he did his digging and research on this guy. When the two get a moment alone, Tom tells Joe that he knows of his association to Reese, and now he wants him dead. Tom reveals where Reese's cottage is located so that Joe will go do his dirty work for him and unalive him. The reason being is that it is insinuated that Reese knows a lot of dirt on Tom Lockwood, and he doesn't want Reese to blackmail him with that information. So Reese and Tom are kind of playing tug of war with Joe and using him as both their puppets. Reese reveals to Joe that he has to listen to him or else Marianne is dead. He tells Joe that he actually kidnapped Marianne and that she never made it out of London like Joe thought she did. Instead, he reveals that she's been trapped in his glass box for a while now, but he won't tell him the location. So Joe goes to Reese's cottage upon the information from Tom and knocks him out at the front door after Reese says, "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Joe ties Reese up in the shed and hurts him and basically does all this brutal stuff to him to get Reese to tell him Marianne's location. Reese was extremely confused and begs for Joe to stop, only for Joe to end up killing him. Once he realizes what he has done, Reese, dressed up in a nice tuxedo, appears out of the shadows. It is then revealed that Joe was hallucinating Reese the entire time and developed a fake relationship with him in his head after becoming a fan of his writings. We cut to a montage of Joe actually committing all these crimes.
Some shadow killer. You.
Jonathan, you absolute perv. What are you doing here?
And he was the one who captured Marianne and put her in a box. In the meantime, Nadia finds a key in Joe's apartment and cracks the code on where it belongs. She ends up finding Marianne and she promises to come back and save her. They didn't want to call the police because Marianne claimed that Joe would just flee and get away with it again because he always does. Now, Joe's aware that he was the one who did everything. He tries to figure out where he could have put Marianne. First of all, he got the same exact box from the previous seasons, and I'm wondering how he brought that across the world, unless he had that same glass box built. Reese still shows up here and there as his conscience talking to him, so he gives out some hints for Joe as to where he put the key. Joe figures out that he put the box in an abandoned building that happened to be across Reese's favorite restaurant. Talk about stalker fan. Joe finds Marianne in the cage and he's horrified by what he's done and doesn't even believe that it was him. He promises to set her free once he comes up with a plan. Mind you, Nadia is also hiding in the corner because she's afraid of what Joe will do if she catches her. After Joe returns later that night to set her free, he finds that she ended up overdosing on the medication that he put in the box for her earlier. All he could think of was her daughter and how he messed up really badly. Him and Marianne had a conversation earlier because she received a text message from the babysitter saying that Marianne lost custody of her daughter. He decides to take her lifeless body out and leave it on a bench to make it look like she was asleep so that the locals can find her in the morning. Now it only gets crazier from here. Nadia is telling the story to her boyfriend of how she helped Marianne escape. First, Marianne's phone was outside the box in her bag, but not accessible to her. So Nadia changes the babysitter's number on her phone to her own, so that when Marianne asks Joe to send a text to let her daughter know she's okay, he's actually texting Nadia. This way, they tricked Joe into thinking that Marianne was going to lose full custody of her daughter and he would feel sympathetic enough and maybe let her go. Nadia admits that when she borrowed ketamine, it was a way to fake Marianne's death and that just the right amount makes your body lifeless for a while. Upon seeing Marianne's lifeless body, Joe takes her out on the bench and leaves her there. Nadia then sneaks up after Joe's gone and injects Marianne back to life. That was their genius plan to outsmart Joe and let Marianne go back to her daughter. Joe has a couple more crazy tasks on his list, and then he kills Tom Lockwood because Kate was afraid her father would never stop controlling her and her life decisions. Cut to the next scene, Joe wants to end things once and for all for himself. So after resolving what he needed to be done, he decides to throw Reese, or his alter ego, off the bridge and into the water, and then he throws himself off. After nearly dying and then being rescued by police, Kate visits him in the hospital and tells him she's inherited all of her father's assets and that Reese's death is already covered up and the evidence with Joe's DNA is scrapped. Joe realizes how much more he loves Kate for all of the things she did and decides that he should accept his darker side and embrace it. Cut to Nadia. She's in Joe's apartment once again taking pictures of evidence for the police, and her boyfriend is on watch outside. Joe confronts Nadia after catching her sneak out of his apartment and tells her to unlock her phone and deletes all the photos and tells her about how he always knew it would be his smartest student. She steps back in fear and falls back behind a car where she sees her boyfriend's unalive body because Joe took care of him earlier. He puts a knife to her hand and tells her that no one will believe her if she tries to plead her case. She gets framed and imprisoned for those crimes, and Joe moves on and moves back to New York City with Kate. Kate runs her father's business now with Joe as her partner, and they work on fixing his public image so that he can start fresh. He claims that he's a victim of his ex-wife Love and that he wants to work on reestablishing himself as Joe Goldberg. Wow, this season was absolutely nuts. Let's talk about some of the analysis and parallels. I did not expect them to take the Fight Club route. If you've never seen Fight Club, I don't want to ruin it for you, but if you know what happens in the movie, I guess you can say it has a similar theme. Now, we all know that Reese and Joe's relationship was all in Joe's head. He was so obsessed with this man that he developed some sort of parasocial relationship with him, and his deepest, darkest thoughts and emotions manifested into the form of Reese. That is why he is the darker side of him, trying to convince him to do things we wouldn't think Joe is capable of, kind of like the little devil on his shoulder. Reese represented his alter ego, or much darker side, and Joe believed that they shared commonalities just because they both struggled as children, and Reese came from poverty as well. Most of the time, Joe was fighting with Reese or himself to justify certain actions and understand why he would have done those things. I genuinely think that Joe had a mental breakdown this season and couldn't fully believe that he was capable of doing things like locking Marianne up or leaving her in the box without food for weeks. And I was really shocked when Joe left medication for her in the box because it's super insensitive to tease a recovering addict. I definitely think that this was the darker side of Joe we were all not ready for. But the thing is, he was always this person. He always had it in him. We tend to forget that he's a terrible person that has been trying to justify his own morals and actions for the past 4 seasons. The only reason why the audience may sympathize with him is because the story is being narrated from his perspective and we hear every detail of him justifying everything. But just imagine if we saw the entire show from one of the victims' perspectives. Then we'd be freaked out and not as intrigued at his character. The episode with Marianne narrating really showed how the perspective matters and affects the audience's views tremendously. But in reality, he did a lot of senseless killings even in the past seasons, And there's no way we can forget that. He was definitely bound to crack one of these days, and him trying to move across the world to start a new life was not going to help it, because he still has to deal with his problems, all of his internal problems. Another thing I noticed is Kate and Love are so alike. Both come from extremely wealthy and powerful families and have done questionable things in the past that got covered up. Let's not forget that Love killed her brother's babysitter when she was a teenager. I guess you can say Joe has a type. The only difference is that Kate is a bit more composed and calculated, whereas Love was extremely impulsive and created a mess only for Joe to clean up after. They definitely were going to drive each other crazy. Tom Lockwood and Joe are basically the same person. Both are extremely loyal to their loved ones, even if it means doing questionable things to prove it or to protect them. Tom can send his people to do the dirty work and have his hands fully clean. Joe is a hands-on type of dude and does it all himself. I think Joe is extremely calculated and analyzes every outcome of the situation. He is really smart when it comes to his line of work, but Tom just gets it done without having to think twice. I think the only difference between the two is that Tom has power and wealth, along with the ability to get away with nearly anything and still come out in public with a clean image. However, now that Joe and Kate are together as a team, maybe he'll feel safer knowing that she'll have his back and he doesn't have to worry about his past catching up anymore. This season was really interesting, and I couldn't have predicted the alter ego hallucination route myself. I think it was clever that the writers finally have Joe accept his darker side this season, because it was eventually going to get played out with the whole stalking a new lover and repeating the same killings again and again. It's really smart that they progressed the storyline with an inevitable mental breakdown to remind us that in actuality, Joe is an extremely dark, troubled person. As much as some audience members have rooted for him in the past, we have to accept that he was a very dark-minded person. So I believe it was a really creative way to evolve the storyline, because I was getting tired of the whole stalking lover theme. This season kind of lost me for a bit in the beginning because of all the introductions of new characters. I get that he is in a new setting and he's befriending a large group of elites. However, I found myself kind of bored in some parts, and they may have been essential to the storylines, but I didn't feel like anything would be missing from the plot if it wasn't excluded. For instance, there was a whole other storyline about Phoebe and Adam, the little toxic couple, and them contemplating on getting married. And then earlier in the season, it was revealed that Adam had a really strange kink, and Joe found out about that in the back of a kitchen. I won't even really get into it, but I know that most parts were added for dramatization, and they most likely weren't important or, contributory to the plot, in my opinion. They didn't really seem necessary. Nadia didn't get a lot of screen time, but was one of the essential characters in the plot. Although it was a great plot twist, I still am extremely upset that Nadia was framed and Joe did her so dirty. I was rooting for her the entire time, and I feel so bad that she has to live with the trauma of seeing her unalive boyfriend and just being stuck in prison. I'm so happy that Marianne got away and is able to be back with her daughter though. It is announced that there will be a season 5, correct me if I'm wrong, and that it will be the last and final season. Here are my predictions for season 5, or just potential characters being brought back. Still have some people alive that can take Joe down. 1, Marianne is still alive, so she could possibly return the favor and free Nadia. 2, Ray Quinn, Love's father, is still out there, and once he sees that very public interview with Joe still being alive, he might want his revenge. 3, Ellie from season 2 is still alive, and we don't know where she could be. Although I know the actress Jenna Ortega is a little busy nowadays, but who knows if they will pull her back for the last season. I think her character is really smart and witty, and she would be able to crack the case. 4, Dr. Nikki from season 1, who Joe framed for Beck's death and disappearance, is still locked up for that crime. So if he really wanted to, he could take Joe down along with the others who have dirt on him. And 5, let's not forget that Paco from season 1, the little kid neighbor, is still alive. The only reason why I think he's irrelevant is because because he watched Joe lock Beck in his basement and he didn't say anything. So I think he would be just as crazy as Joe, but a mini version that kind of supports him. So if season 5 is the last season, those are some potential characters they could bring back. Personally, I'd be really sad to see the series end, but that might be the best move for the show. This show doesn't need to be dragged out any longer because I feel like it will eventually get repetitive and tiresome. I really like the show, and it is one of the first new shows that was able to catch my attention and have me watching it years later. I never stay consistent with shows or keep up, but this one has had me since maybe 2018 or 2019 when it first came out, and I'm in the middle where I don't want the show to end because I want more out of it, but I also believe it needs to end eventually or it'll become one of those shows that went in a ridiculous direction like Riverdale and Pretty Little Liars. I do look forward to seeing how the writers will evolve the show because it must be tough having to basically surpass the previous season. It's like having to pass the really high standards that they set for themselves. I hope you guys enjoyed my really long recap and breakdown as well as analysis. I know I'm not discussing every single detail, but if you watch the show or are a fan, please let me know down below what opinions and thoughts you have. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.